My name is Kayla Reynolds. I'm 36 years old. And the night that destroyed everything wasn't when I came home from Afghanistan missing pieces of my soul, or when the VA prescribed pills that couldn't touch the kind of pain that lives in your bones. It was last Tuesday in our kitchen in Millfield, Ohio, watching my husband Derek slide divorce papers across the counter with the clinical precision of someone disposing of garbage. "I can't be married to a woman who flips burgers for a living," he said, not looking at me, focusing instead on the McDonald's visor I'd forgotten to take off after my shift. "This isn't what I signed up for, Kayla. You're 36 years old working fast food. It's embarrassing." The words hit harder than shrapnel. To him, I wasn't a wife, wasn't a partner. I was a failure in a polyester uniform who reminded him daily that his life hadn't turned out the way he'd planned. To him, I wasn't a wife who'd sacrificed everything for her country. I was an embarrassment in a paper hat who reminded him daily that his life hadn't turned out the way he'd advertised on social media. Tonight, he was just divorcing a woman whose true story would make headlines. The McDonald's on Route 33 smelled like every broken dream in America grease that never quite washed out of your clothes, industrial cleaner that burned your sinuses, and the particular desperation that came from working minimum wage at 36 while pretending it was temporary. The afternoon rush was in full swing. Cars wrapped around the building like a serpent of SUVs and pickup trucks, each driver tapping their steering wheel impatiently while I stood behind the counter in my polyester uniform, headset crackling with orders that blurred together into white noise. Big Mac, no pickles, large fries, Diet Coke. The endless repetition of a life that had shrunk to fit inside a drive-through window. That's when Derek walked in. I saw him through the glass doors before he reached the counter, 6'2", still wearing his State Farm polo from work, carrying a manila envelope that meant our 3-year marriage was about to become another statistic in Millfield County's divorce records. The lunch crowd was thick around us. Families with screaming toddlers, construction workers grabbing quick meals, teenagers spending their allowances on McFlurries, normal people living normal lives, while my world prepared to collapse in public. "Kayla," Derek's voice cut through the ambient noise of fryers and conversation, commanding attention with the authority of someone who'd never worked a job that required a name tag. "We need to finish this." He slapped the envelope onto the counter like he was serving me a subpoena, right next to the register where Mrs. Henderson from the Methodist Church was counting out exact change for her senior coffee. The sound made everyone within 10 feet turn to stare: customers, co-workers, the teenage manager who'd hired me 6 months ago when McDonald's was the only place in town willing to give a veteran with PTSD a chance. "Sign the papers, Kayla," Derek continued, his voice getting louder with each word. "I told you on the phone, this is over. I'm done pretending this is temporary." Jenny, my coworker at Register 2, tried to look busy restocking napkin dispensers, but I could feel her watching. Could feel everyone watching. The construction workers had stopped mid-bite to observe our domestic drama. Mrs. Henderson clutched her coffee like she was witnessing a car accident. "Derek, please," I whispered, feeling my face burn with shame that had nothing to do with the heat from the fryers. "Can we do this somewhere private?" "Private?" He laughed, not cruel, but worse. Dismissive. The kind of laughter that said my feelings weren't worth considering. "Kayla, this is where you work. This is your life. Might as well make it official here." He pulled a pen from his shirt pocket and slammed it down next to the envelope, the sound echoing through the restaurant like a gavel. "I didn't marry a burger flipper," Derek announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the dining area. "I married someone with potential, someone who was going to make something of herself. Not this." He gestured around the McDonald's with the theatrical disgust of someone addressing a jury about moral failures, the golden arches, the promotional posters for limited-time offers, the industrial carpet and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly sick. "You're 36 years old, Kayla," he continued, warming to his performance while I felt my soul shrinking with each word. 36. And this is what you've become. Grease stains and minimum wage. Do you understand how embarrassing this is for me? The silence that followed was absolute. 20 people frozen in place, processing the public execution of someone they'd been ordering food from for 6 months. The teenager at Register 3 had tears in her eyes. Even the customers looked uncomfortable witnessing someone's complete humiliation. "I need someone with ambition," Derek declared with finality, like he was delivering a verdict that would be remembered long after the lunch rush ended. Someone who dreams bigger than asking if people want fries with that. You've wasted your life, Kayla. You're nothing but grease and smoke. Nothing but grease and smoke. The words hit me like shrapnel, finding every vulnerable spot I'd tried to armor against exactly this moment. Around me, conversations had died completely. The only sounds were fryers bubbling, the ice machine cycling, and my own heartbeat echoing in my ears like incoming artillery. What Derek didn't know, what nobody in that McDonald's could have imagined, was that the hands he watched flip quarter-pounders had once carried Corporal Martinez through Taliban crossfire while taking sniper rounds that left scars he'd never bothered to ask about. That the woman he was divorcing had earned medals that hung in a shadow box he'd made me hide in our bedroom closet because they made guests uncomfortable. But standing there in my polyester uniform, absorbing his contempt, while strangers watched my marriage dissolve into McDonald's folklore, I felt exactly like what he said I was. Nothing but grease and smoke. I looked at the divorce papers spread across the counter like evidence in a trial where I'd already been found guilty. Derek's signature was neat, confident, final. All that remained was my name on the line that would officially transform me from disappointed wife into discarded burden. My hands shook as I picked up the pen. Around me, 20 people held their breath while I signed away. 3 years of marriage that had apparently meant nothing to the man who'd promised to love me through better or worse. The pen felt heavier than any weapon I'd carried in Afghanistan. When I finished signing, Derek snatched the papers like he was afraid I'd change my mind and ask for another chance to embarrass him with my lack of ambition. "It's better this way," he said, not looking at me as he tucked the envelope under his arm. "For both of us, you can focus on this, and I can find someone who actually has goals." He walked out of that McDonald's with the confident stride of someone who'd just solved a problem that had been bothering him for months. Through the glass doors, I could see him climbing into his Honda Accord, already reaching for his phone, probably calling his mother to tell her the good news about finally getting rid of his minimum-wage wife. The silence in the restaurant lasted exactly 30 seconds before conversations resumed, quieter now, seasoned with the particular discomfort that comes from witnessing someone's complete destruction over Big Macs and Diet Cokes. I stood behind that counter, divorce papers signed, wedding ring still on my finger, feeling the weight of 20 pairs of eyes trying not to stare at the woman who'd just been publicly classified as worthless. That's when I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I slipped my wedding ring off my finger, the simple gold band Derek had bought at K Jewelers 3 years ago when he thought marrying a veteran would make him look patriotic, and dropped it into the trash bin next to the fryer. The sizzle of hot oil drowned out the sound of my heart breaking. But what nobody in that McDonald's understood, what Derek would learn when the President of the United States shook my hand on national television 8 months later, was that some people carry their worth in places deeper than wedding rings and job descriptions. I'd been a hero long before I became a burger flipper. And I'd be a hero long after Derek realized exactly what kind of woman he'd thrown away like yesterday's French fries. The Medal of Honor ceremony would remind the whole country who Kayla Reynolds actually was. But that afternoon, standing behind the McDonald's counter in my grease-stained uniform, I was just the woman who'd been divorced in public by someone too small to understand that some battles are worth more than any marriage certificate. The customers went back to their meals. The fryers kept bubbling. The drive-through line kept moving. And I kept working, carrying secrets that would one day silence every person who'd watched Derek destroy me for their entertainment. The nightmares always started the same way, the sound of rotor blades cutting through Afghan air like thunder you could feel in your bones. Then the radio crackling with coordinates that meant American soldiers were dying, while I tried to navigate a Chinook through Taliban crossfire that lit up the desert like the 4th of July. Dust off 7-2. We've got 4 KIA, 6 wounded, need immediate evac. The voice would crackle through my headset while I gripped the cyclic stick, with hands that had learned not to shake under pressure. But I always woke up before the part where I saved them. Always woke up in my studio apartment above Rosie's Diner on Main Street, sheets soaked with sweat, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape the memories I'd buried under McDonald's uniforms and small-town anonymity. 3 a.m. became my witching hour, the time when Millfield, Ohio went completely quiet except for the occasional semi-thundering past on Route 33, carrying cargo that would never be as precious as the lives I'd once carried through hostile airspace. I'd lie there in the darkness, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that looked like a map of Afghanistan if you squinted hard enough, trying to reconcile the woman who'd once commanded respect in combat zones with the woman Derek had divorced for lack of ambition. The shadow box sat in my closet like a time bomb I was afraid to detonate. Bronze star, purple heart, air medal with 14 oak leaf clusters. Photographs of my crew from the 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers, men who'd trusted me to bring them home from places that didn't exist on any civilian map. Captain Kayla Reynolds, they'd called me then. Not burger flipper or minimum wage failure, but captain. The title that had meant everything in a world where respect was earned through competence and courage, not suburban dinner conversations about career advancement. But that world felt like someone else's life now. Someone braver, stronger, more certain of her worth than the woman who flinched when the McDonald's fryer popped too loud, reminding her of incoming mortar rounds. The letter arrived on a Tuesday that started like every other Tuesday alarm at 5:30 a.m., shower that never quite washed off the smell of grease, uniform that made me invisible to everyone except customers who wanted their orders faster and cheaper. Mrs. Patterson from the post office handed it to me with the reverence reserved for official government correspondence. Thick paper, gold seal. The kind of envelope that changed lives or ended them, depending on what branch of service had sent it. Department of Defense, Office of the Secretary. My hands shook as I opened it, standing right there in the post office while Mrs. Patterson pretended to sort mail but actually watched every expression that crossed my face. Captain Reynolds, the letter began, and I had to sit down on the bench next to the wanted posters because nobody had called me captain in 3 years. You have been selected to receive the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty during combat operations in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Medal of Honor. The words, blurred as tears I'd been holding back for months, finally broke through defenses I'd built stronger than any forward operating base. The ceremony will take place at the White House on November 15th, with presentation by the President of the United States. The White House. While Derek was probably explaining to his co-workers why he'd divorced the burger flipper, I was being invited to receive the highest military decoration from the Commander-in-Chief. I sat in that post office, still wearing my McDonald's uniform, holding an invitation that would make national headlines, and finally understood what vindication felt like when it came with presidential recognition and CNN coverage. The mission they were honoring had happened 8 months before I'd left the Army. September 14th, 2019. Alpha Company had been pinned down in a valley that had turned into a kill zone, taking casualties faster than ground forces could extract them. The Taliban had positioned themselves in caves that made standard rescue approaches suicide missions. That's when they'd called the Night Stalkers. Dust off 7-2, you're flying into hell, Major Williams had told me over the radio. Enemy positions on 3 sides, weather going to shit, and our boys are dying while we're talking. I'd taken my bird through ground fire that looked like laser light shows, landed in a hot LZ while my crew returned suppressing fire, and loaded 13 wounded soldiers who wouldn't have made it home without someone willing to fly into conditions that grounded everyone else. The distinguished flying cross they'd given me afterward had seemed like enough recognition. I'd never expected the Medal of Honor review process to take 4 years, never imagined that the mission I'd filed as just doing my job would be considered worthy of the nation's highest honor. But sitting in Mrs. Patterson's post office, reading an invitation signed by generals whose names I'd only seen in history books, I finally understood that some achievements transcend the people who refuse to acknowledge them. Derek had divorced a burger flipper, but the President of the United States was about to pin the Medal of Honor on someone whose courage had saved 13 American lives while he'd been safe at his State Farm office, selling insurance policies and complaining about his wife's lack of career advancement. The ceremony was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks for word to spread through Millfield that their McDonald's employee had been selected for recognition that most military personnel only read about in history books. I walked home that afternoon carrying a letter that would transform me from family embarrassment into national hero, from minimum wage failure into someone parents would tell their children about when they talked about what service actually meant. The shadow box in my closet suddenly felt less like evidence of a life I'd lost and more like proof of a woman I'd always been, even when nobody else could see her under polyester uniforms and grease-stained aprons. Captain Reynolds was coming home. Not to Afghanistan, but to the recognition she'd earned and the vindication she'd never sought but always deserved. Derek would learn about it the same way everyone else would, watching CNN coverage of a Medal of Honor ceremony where the President of the United States would honor the burger flipper he'd thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. The woman he'd divorced for having no ambition was about to receive the highest honor America could bestow on its heroes. And I was finally ready to let the world see exactly who Kayla Reynolds had been all along. The Kennedy Center Opera House felt like a cathedral built for heroes. 2,000 seats filled with generals, senators, Medal of Honor recipients whose names were carved into American history, and family members who understood what it meant to love someone willing to die for strangers. I stood backstage in my Army service uniform, the blue dress uniform I hadn't worn since my retirement ceremony 3 years ago, feeling the weight of decorations that told stories most people would never comprehend. Bronze star with V device, Purple Heart, Air Medal with 14 oak leaf clusters. Each ribbon representing missions where split-second decisions meant American soldiers came home to families who'd never know how close they'd come to folding flags. The ceremony was being broadcast live on every major network. C-SPAN cameras capturing every angle while reporters explained to civilian audiences what the Medal of Honor actually meant, why fewer than 3,500 people had received it since the Civil War, why Captain Kayla Reynolds was about to join the most exclusive brotherhood in American military history. Through the curtain, I could see the audience settling into their seats. 2,000 people dressed in their finest clothes, here to witness something most would only read about in history books. The front rows reserved for VIPs, members of Congress, senior military leadership, whose decisions shaped global security. That's when I saw him. Derek sat in the 7th row, wearing a suit I'd never seen before, his arm around a blonde woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a suburban lifestyle magazine. His new girlfriend, probably. Someone with ambition who worked in marketing or real estate, someone who'd never embarrassed him by asking if customers wanted fries with their order. My stomach dropped like I was back in that Chinook, taking evasive action while Taliban fighters tried to turn my bird into scattered metal across Afghan mountains. He'd come. After divorcing me for lacking potential, after publicly humiliating me in front of McDonald's customers, after walking away from our marriage like he was disposing of garbage, he'd come to watch the burger flipper receive the nation's highest military honor. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Almost. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice filled the opera house with authority that made conversations die instantly. The President of the United States. 2,000 people rose as one, while "Hail to the Chief" echoed through speakers that carried presidential fanfare to every corner of American television. I watched through the curtain as the Commander-in-Chief took his position at the podium, flanked by flags and surrounded by the kind of ceremony reserved for moments when nations honor their finest. "We gather today," the President began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed auditorium, "to recognize extraordinary heroism in the face of mortal danger. To honor someone who exemplified the warrior ethos that has defined American military service for over 2 centuries. The teleprompter told him my story, but I lived it. September 14th, 2019, Alpha Company pinned down in a valley that had become a killing field. 13 wounded soldiers who wouldn't survive without immediate medical evacuation. Weather conditions that grounded every other aircraft. Taliban positions that turned standard approach routes into suicide missions. Captain Kayla Reynolds," the President continued while I felt tears building behind my eyes, "flew her helicopter through concentrated enemy fire to reach American soldiers who had been written off as casualties. She landed in a hot landing zone, loaded 13 wounded men, and flew them to safety while taking direct fire from multiple positions." Through the curtain, I could see Derek's face draining of color as the President described missions the burger flipper had completed while he'd been safe in his State Farm office, complaining about quarterly sales targets. Her actions that day exemplified courage beyond measure. The President's voice grew stronger with each word. Devotion to duty that transcends personal safety. The kind of heroism that defines the American spirit at its finest. That's when they called my name. Captain Kayla Reynolds. I walked onto that stage feeling 2,000 pairs of eyes tracking my movement, cameras broadcasting my approach to millions of Americans who were finally meeting the woman Derek had discarded for lacking ambition. The applause started immediately, not polite ceremony clapping, but sustained, thunderous recognition that filled the opera house like rolling thunder, generals rising to their feet, senators standing in respect. Medal of Honor recipients whose own heroism had earned them seats in this exclusive audience, now honoring someone joining their brotherhood. I saw Derek in the 7th row, frozen in his seat while everyone around him stood. His girlfriend tugging at his sleeve, confused why he wasn't participating in the ovation. His mouth hanging open like someone who'd just witnessed something impossible. The president stepped forward with the Medal of Honor, the light blue ribbon with 13 white stars, the gold medallion that had been touched by presidents and heroes for over 150 years. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, he said, his words echoing through speakers that carried them to every television in America. I present the Medal of Honor to Captain Kayla Reynolds. The medal settled around my neck with weight that had nothing to do with gold, and everything to do with recognition that transcended every assumption people had made about the woman in the McDonald's uniform. I saluted the President of the United States, feeling tears streaming down my face that I didn't bother hiding. Not tears of shame, I'd cried those for months after Derek's divorce papers. These were tears of vindication, of truth finally speaking louder than lies, of a moment when the whole nation understood exactly who their burger flipper actually was. The standing ovation lasted 12 minutes. 12 minutes of sustained applause while cameras captured Derek sitting motionless among 2,000 people celebrating the woman he'd thrown away for having no ambition. Through my tears, I could see him struggling to process what he was witnessing. The worthless wife he'd divorced was being honored by the president. The failure he'd been embarrassed by was now someone parents would tell their children about when they explained what real heroism looked like. As the applause finally died down and I prepared to return to my seat, among other Medal of Honor recipients, I looked directly at Derek for the first time since he'd walked out of that McDonald's with our signed divorce papers. He was crying, not from pride he'd forfeited the right to that, but from something deeper. The recognition that he'd been married to someone extraordinary and had thrown her away because he'd been too shallow to see past a polyester uniform. His blonde girlfriend was staring at him with confusion, probably wondering why he was crying at a ceremony honoring some soldier she'd never heard of. She'd never know she was sitting next to a man who'd divorced a Medal of Honor recipient because he thought success was measured in career advancement and social media updates. That night, as the ceremony concluded and America learned the story of Captain Kayla Reynolds, Derek would drive home to whatever suburban life he'd built with his new girlfriend, carrying the knowledge that he'd been too blind to recognize a hero when she was flipping burgers beside him. But I would return to Millfield, Ohio, carrying the Medal of Honor and the understanding that worth doesn't require recognition from people too small to see it. The town that had watched Derek divorce the burger flipper would now know they'd been served by someone whose courage had saved 13 American lives. The spatula had never defined me. The McDonald's uniform had never contained me. The lies Derek told had never touched the truth I carried. I was Captain Kayla Reynolds, Medal of Honor recipient, and no amount of grease or small-town gossip could change what I'd achieved when it mattered most. The world finally saw what Derek never could. I was never just flipping burgers. I was serving my country. I always had been. Kayla's story reminds us that worth isn't defined by job titles or the opinions of people who never bothered to ask about our real story. That heroes often work quietly among us, that service takes many forms, and that the most extraordinary people are sometimes hiding behind the most ordinary uniforms. If this story moved you, if you've ever been judged by your current circumstances rather than your full story, or if you've learned not to assume someone's worth based on where they work, share this video. Let it reach someone who needs to know their past service matters, even when their present doesn't look like success to others. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes, the veterans working civilian jobs while carrying medals in closets, the service members who sacrificed everything and rebuilt quietly, the people whose greatest achievements happened before you met them. Because the most important question isn't what job someone has today. It's whether you're wise enough to recognize that every person has a story, And some of those stories include chapters of heroism that would humble you if you bothered to ask. Share this story with someone who's ever been underestimated based on their current job, who's rebuilding after service, or who deserves recognition for sacrifices others will never understand. I was never just flipping burgers. I was serving my country.